Please confirm the sentence before we send him down, the oldest scientist in the chamber said quietly. Because if he survives, history will remember every one of us. No one answered. They did not have to. The verdict had already been signed. Across the vast observation hall overlooking the gray horizon of Class-5, dozens of alien officials stood in complete confidence, their eyes fixed on a single transport shuttle descending through poisonous clouds. Every civilization represented in the Galactic Research Assembly agreed on one fact. Nothing intelligent survived on a Class-5 death world. Not for long. Certainly not a human. Nathan Brooks sat alone inside the shuttle, his wrists resting on his knees as the engines rattled beneath him. 34 years old. Born in Billings, Montana. Former industrial systems engineer. No military record. No survival medals. No legendary past. Just an ordinary man who had made one impossible mistake during a diplomatic supply dispute that spiraled into a political disaster. He had expected prison. Maybe years behind reinforced walls somewhere on the edge of civilized space. Instead, they gave him something far worse. Exile. Mr. Brooks, the pilot said without turning around. The surface pressure is nearly twice the galactic standard. Atmospheric toxins exceed acceptable exposure limits for every known member species. Once you step outside, we are not authorized to return. Nathan gave a tired smile. Sounds like customer service could use some work. The pilot did not laugh. Neither did the security officer standing beside the hatch. The silence said enough. Nathan leaned back and stared through the reinforced window. Jagged mountains stretched across the horizon like broken teeth. Rivers of dark mineral deposits carved through endless valleys. Lightning flickered without rain. Even from several thousand feet up, the world looked hostile, as though nature itself had decided visitors were unwelcome. Somewhere above the atmosphere, inside the assembly station, high biologist Koresh studied Nathan's medical profile. Heart rate elevated. One assistant reported. Stress hormones increasing. Koresh folded his 4 hands behind his back. Normal. Fear is a rational response. Another researcher tilted her head. Do humans usually survive this level of psychological pressure? Koresh answered without hesitation. No species does. Back inside the shuttle, Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and found the old photograph he had almost forgotten. His parents stood beside an aging pickup truck outside their family ranch, both smiling into the summer sun. His younger sister had scribbled a sentence across the bottom years ago. Come home when this is over. He laughed softly through his nose. I'm working on it, Em. A warning alarm echoed through the cabin. Surface contact in 60 seconds, the pilot announced. Nathan slipped the photograph back into his pocket and slowly stood. His legs felt heavy. His mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed that stepping outside meant walking into his own funeral. The hatch unlocked with a deep metallic click. Cold air seeped through the seams, carrying the sharp scent of minerals and something unfamiliar. Nathan looked toward the security officer. Can I ask one question? The officer nodded once. If I'm still alive in 30 days, Nathan paused, swallowing hard before forcing a crooked smile. Do I finally get my appeal? The officer looked away before answering. No one has ever asked us that before. Then the hatch opened, and the entire assembly watched what they believed were the final steps of the weakest species they had ever underestimated. Nathan took one careful step onto the dark stone, and the shuttle hatch sealed behind him before his second boot touched the ground. The engines roared overhead for only a few seconds before fading into the endless sky, leaving behind a silence so complete that it almost felt alive. He stood there alone, breathing through the filtration mask built into his emergency survival suit, watching the dust drift across the black landscape. Well, he muttered to himself, forcing a nervous smile. I guess this is home now. His wrist display immediately flashed a stream of warnings. Atmospheric toxins detected. Surface temperature fluctuating. Gravity exceeding safe Terran operational standards. Recommended exposure time, 0 minutes. Nathan laughed once under his breath. Helpful. Above the planet, inside the Galactic Research Assembly, every sensor remained locked onto his biosignature. Dr. Lasara adjusted the live projection hovering over the conference table. Heart rate is 121 beats per minute. Oxygen consumption is rising faster than expected. High biologist Koresh nodded without emotion. The increased gravity is compressing his lungs. Human physiology will begin to fail soon. Another researcher looked toward the massive observation window. Estimated survival time. 4 hours, Koresh answered. Perhaps 6 if he remains inactive. Nathan knew nothing about their predictions. He only knew that every breath felt heavier than the last. Even lifting his backpack seemed to require twice the effort it should have. His legs burned after only 50 yards. The rocky ground shifted under every step, making balance difficult. Sweat rolled down his forehead despite the cold air pressing against his skin. He stopped beside a cluster of jagged stones and bent forward with both hands on his knees, pulling slow breaths through the filter. Panic whispered in the back of his mind. Keep moving and you collapse. Stop moving and you freeze. Think, he said quietly. You fix machines for a living. Problems are problems. He looked around instead of charging forward. The landscape was ugly, but it was not random. Sharp cliffs blocked most of the wind. Small patches of dark vegetation only appeared where the rocks formed natural barriers. If plants were growing there, something had to be protecting them. Nathan changed direction and headed toward the nearest ridge. Every step felt like climbing stairs with a loaded toolbox strapped to his back. Nearly 30 minutes later, he reached the sheltered side of the rock formation. The wind almost disappeared. His breathing became easier. He smiled for the first time since landing. There you are, he whispered. Somebody around here figured this place out before I did. He dropped his pack and carefully examined the ground. Thin vines wrapped around the stones, collecting tiny drops of moisture from the morning fog. Nathan remembered an old camping trip with his father in the mountains of Montana. His dad had once told him, if plants are alive, they already know where the water is. Follow them before you follow your instincts. Nathan gently squeezed one of the vines, watching clear drops gather in his palm. He stared at them for several seconds before laughing in disbelief. Dad, you old genius. Hundreds of miles above him, the research chamber suddenly became unusually quiet. Dr. Lasara looked back at Koresh. He changed his route after observing local vegetation. Another scientist frowned. There is no survival manual for Class-5 available to him. Koresh remained silent for several long seconds before finally speaking. No. His voice had lost a measure of certainty. There is not. As Nathan drank the small amount of collected water and rested beneath the sheltering rocks, he had no idea that the countdown to his death had already begun to fall apart. Not because he was stronger than anyone expected, but because he had done something none of the observers had bothered to predict. He had stopped trying to conquer the planet and started trying to understand it. The first night on Class-5 never truly became dark. Strange bands of pale blue light drifted across the clouds, giving the rocky landscape an eerie glow that made it impossible to tell where the ground ended and the horizon began. Nathan sat beneath the shelter of the stone ridge, wrapping his arms around himself as the temperature dropped faster than he expected. His emergency suit helped, but every hour the battery indicator slipped lower. One problem at a time, he whispered. Panic tomorrow if tomorrow gets here. He forced himself to stay awake instead of wasting energy worrying. Every few minutes, he watched the open valley beyond the rocks. The wind always shifted before anything moved. Tiny pebbles rolled in the same direction. The vines flattened against the ground. Even the strange grass seemed to lean away from something invisible. Everything out here gives a warning, he murmured. You just have to notice it. Hundreds of miles above him, the observation room had grown noticeably quieter than it had been during the landing. Dr. Lasara expanded several holographic charts. His oxygen efficiency has improved by 12% since touchdown. One of the younger researchers frowned. Impossible. He has no environmental adaptation implants. Confirmed, another scientist replied. Medical records show no enhancements. High biologist Koresh folded his hands behind his back. He is changing his behavior instead of expecting the environment to change for him. The youngest researcher tilted her head. Is that common among humans? Koresh hesitated longer than anyone expected. Our files describe them as persistent. Persistent is not a scientific explanation. Koresh looked back at Nathan's live feed. Perhaps our files are incomplete. Down below, Nathan carefully emptied the contents of his backpack across a flat stone. 2 emergency food packs, a portable repair kit, 50 feet of utility cord, a flashlight, a multi-tool, a compact thermal blanket. Nothing about the equipment looked impressive, But to an engineer, every object represented several different possibilities. He picked up the cord and smiled. Dad always said never pack for what you expect. Pack for what you cannot predict. He tied the cord between two rocks, hanging the thermal blanket behind it to block the strongest wind funneling through the ridge. It was not a cabin. It was barely a wall. Still, when he stepped behind it, the air immediately felt calmer. That is better, he said with a tired grin. He opened one food pack, but stopped before taking a bite. Instead, he broke it into 4 equal portions. Congratulations, he laughed softly. You are officially on the worst meal plan in the galaxy. The next morning brought another surprise. Nathan noticed small tracks circling the rocks, but never crossing into the area where the vines collected moisture. Whatever lived on the planet avoided those plants. Instead of ignoring the clue, he spent nearly an hour simply watching from a distance. You know something I do not, he said quietly while studying the tiny creatures moving across the valley floor. So, I am going to let you teach me. Above the planet, another alert echoed through the research chamber. Survival probability had automatically recalculated. For hours had become 28. Several scientists exchanged uneasy glances. One finally spoke the question everyone else had been avoiding. What if we have been measuring strength the wrong way? No one answered. Koresh continued watching the humans sitting alone among the rocks, making careful notes with a sharpened piece of charcoal on the inside of an empty food wrapper. For the first time in his career, the alien scientist realized he was no longer observing a doomed prisoner. He was watching someone quietly turn an impossible world into a problem that could be solved, one small decision at a time. By the 4th morning, Nathan had stopped counting the hours and started measuring progress instead. One more place to collect water. One more way to block the wind. One more lesson the planet was willing to teach before trying to humble him again. His beard had begun to grow in, and every muscle in his body reminded him that even standing still on Class-5 required effort. He stretched his shoulders with a quiet groan and looked toward the ridgeline where the first rays of pale sunlight were creeping across the stone. You are still here, he said to himself. That is enough for today. He had noticed something strange over the past 2 days. The small animals always followed nearly the same paths, weaving between clusters of dark rocks before disappearing into narrow openings in the cliffs. Nathan crouched behind a boulder and watched patiently instead of chasing them. You have food, he whispered. You have shelter. You are solving the same problems I am. An hour passed before he stood again. Following their trail led him to a shallow cave hidden behind thick curtains of hanging vines. It was dry inside. The ceiling blocked most of the wind, and the stone floor stayed noticeably warmer than the open ground outside. Nathan smiled with genuine relief. Now this, he said, dropping his backpack onto the floor, beats sleeping against a rock. Above the planet, another briefing had begun. Dr. Lasara enlarged the latest environmental scan for the senior researchers. The human has established a semi-permanent shelter. One scientist folded his arms. Pure luck. Another shook her head. Luck does not explain repeated success. High biologist Koresh remained focused on the live feed. Continue. Lasara tapped several glowing icons. He has reduced daily energy expenditure by nearly 30%. Water intake has stabilized. Body temperature fluctuations are decreasing. Someone near the back of the chamber spoke quietly. He is adapting. Koresh answered before anyone else could. No. He is reorganizing his behavior faster than the environment can overwhelm him. Back inside the cave, Nathan emptied the repair kit onto the ground. Most of the tools were designed for industrial maintenance, not wilderness survival, but that hardly mattered to an engineer. A tool only needed one purpose until somebody imagined a second one. He removed thin metal brackets from the repair case and wedged them into cracks near the cave entrance. Using utility cord and broad leaves gathered outside, he built a simple barrier that reduced the cold wind flowing through the opening. It looked clumsy, but when he stepped inside and felt the warmer air settle around him, he could not help laughing. Ugly, he admitted, but ugly still works. Later that afternoon, he examined several strange plants growing near the cave. Instead of touching them immediately, he watched tiny animals interact with them first. Some leaves were ignored completely. Others drew insects within minutes. One vine slowly curled around anything that brushed against it. Nathan quietly backed away. Not today, he said. I have made enough bad decisions already. Hundreds of miles overhead, the observation room fell silent once more as another automatic calculation appeared across the main display. Expected survival time had increased again, days instead of hours. One young researcher stared at the numbers in disbelief. We designed every model around physical endurance. Koresh never looked away from Nathan's image. And perhaps that was our mistake. He watched the human carefully reinforce the entrance to his small shelter before sitting down with a tired sigh, already studying the landscape beyond the cave as though tomorrow's problems deserved today's attention. For the first time since the experiment began, Koresh found himself asking a question that none of the assembly had considered when they approved the sentence. What if surviving this world had never depended on being the strongest creature living on it at all? Nathan woke before sunrise because his body had quietly adjusted to the rhythm of Class-5. Every morning began the same way now. Check the shelter. Check the water vines. Walk the perimeter. Look for anything that had changed overnight. The planet never repeated itself exactly, and he had learned that assuming yesterday's solution would work today was the fastest way to make a bad decision. He stepped outside the cave and immediately noticed fresh cracks running across the valley floor. The air felt warmer than usual, carrying a faint metallic smell that had not been there the night before. Something is coming, he said softly. I just do not know what. Instead of wandering farther from camp, Nathan spent the morning improving what he already had. He gathered flat stones and stacked them into a low cooking surface even though he had no fire yet. He reinforced the entrance with heavier rocks. He carefully moved his supplies farther away from the cave opening. None of it felt dramatic, but years spent repairing industrial systems had taught him that small maintenance jobs prevented big disasters. Do the boring work before the emergency, his old supervisor used to tell every new engineer. Nathan smiled at the memory. Guess you were right, Frank. High above the planet, another research meeting was already underway. Dr. Lasara pointed toward a series of medical readings. Muscle density has increased by nearly 8% since arrival. A scientist leaned forward. Impossible. That level of adaptation should require months. Koresh studied the numbers without speaking. Another researcher added, bone stress indicators are stabilizing as well. His cardiovascular system is becoming more efficient under the increased gravity. The room fell quiet. Finally, Koresh spoke. His body is responding to repeated environmental stress. Like every species, someone replied. Koresh slowly shook his head. No, faster than our models predicted. Back on the surface, Nathan climbed halfway up the ridge overlooking his shelter. The climb that had nearly exhausted him during his first day now felt difficult but manageable. He stopped halfway, surprised by the realization. His breathing recovered sooner. His legs no longer trembled with every step. The planet had not become easier. He had simply become a little stronger than the man who first walked out of that shuttle. He laughed to himself. I still hate this place, he said between steady breaths, but at least I do not hate every single step anymore. As he reached the top of the ridge, he noticed several massive stone pillars casting long shadows across the valley. During the hottest part of the afternoon, those shadows stretched directly toward his cave. Nathan quickly sketched the pattern on the back of an empty food wrapper. Natural shade, he whispered. That means lower temperatures. Lower temperatures mean less water loss. It was another tiny piece of the puzzle. Another advantage hidden in plain sight. Hours later, the strange metallic smell returned, stronger this time. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, but instead of rain, they released tiny sparkling mineral particles that coated the rocks like silver dust. Nathan immediately retreated inside the cave, pulling his improvised barrier shut. Whatever that is, he muttered. I am perfectly happy watching it from in here. The sensors orbiting above recorded everything. His decision to seek shelter before exposure reduced his risk dramatically. Dr. Lasara stared at the playback in disbelief. He identified the environmental warning signs before the storm formed. Another scientist frowned. He has never seen this weather event before. Koresh folded his hands behind his back, his voice almost thoughtful now. Perhaps experience is not the only teacher. Observation may be enough. As the glittering storm drifted harmlessly past the cave entrance, Nathan sat against the stone wall, exhausted but calm. He realized something that frightened him almost as much as it comforted him. Class-5 was still trying to break him every single day. The difference was that each day, it was succeeding just a little less than the day before. The morning after the mineral storm, Nathan found the valley strangely quiet. The tiny animals that usually darted between the rocks were gone. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the open ground. He tightened the straps on his backpack and slowly scanned the landscape. "Something scared everything away," he whispered. "Which means I should probably be scared too." Instead of walking into the valley, he climbed higher along the ridge until he found a narrow overlook. From there, he spotted enormous footprints pressed deep into the dark soil below. Each one measured nearly 3 feet across, spaced with deliberate precision, as if whatever had made them never wasted a single step. Nathan crouched lower behind the rocks. "That is definitely not something I want to meet over coffee." He remained perfectly still for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, movement caught his eye. Far below, a massive 6-legged creature emerged from behind a line of stone pillars. It did not charge across the valley or roar into the sky. It moved with quiet confidence, pausing every few yards to study the terrain before continuing. Nathan frowned. "You are hunting," he murmured, "not wandering." His heart pounded, but another thought immediately followed. Predators looked for easy opportunities. If he ran, he became one. If he stayed exposed, he became one. So he did the only thing that made sense. He quietly backed away from the overlook without making unnecessary noise. Hundreds of miles above the planet, alarms sounded inside the observation chamber. Dr. Lasara enlarged the tracking display. "The apex predator has entered his sector." Several scientists leaned forward. "Estimated probability of survival?" one asked. The computer answered before Koresh could speak. "Less than 3%. Another researcher folded his arms. "It is over." Koresh remained silent, watching Nathan's biosignals instead of the predator's location. The human's pulse had increased, but it had not become erratic. "Interesting," Koresh said softly. "He is afraid." The younger scientist looked confused. "Is that unusual?" "No," Koresh replied. "What is unusual is that his fear is making him slower instead of reckless." Nathan returned to his shelter without rushing. The moment he reached the cave, he began working. He stretched the remaining utility cord across a narrow path leading toward the entrance, anchoring it between heavy rocks hidden beneath loose vegetation. A few yards farther uphill, he stacked several unstable stones against the edge of a natural slope. None of it resembled a weapon. It was simply the landscape waiting for gravity to do what gravity always did. "I am not trying to beat you," Nathan said quietly while wiping sweat from his forehead. "I just need you to choose a different direction." Hours later, the ground vibrated beneath his boots. The enormous creature appeared between the stone pillars exactly where Nathan had expected. It lowered its head, studying the area around the cave. Nathan remained completely still inside the shadows, barely breathing. The animal took another cautious step before its front legs brushed against the hidden cord. Startled by the unexpected resistance, it shifted sideways onto the loose slope. Several heavy rocks tumbled down the hillside, filling the narrow passage with dust and noise. The creature immediately backed away, choosing the open valley instead of the confined entrance. Within seconds, it disappeared into the distance. Nathan stayed frozen for another full minute before finally exhaling. "Thank you," he whispered to no one in particular. "I really did not want to find out who would have won that argument." Silence settled over the observation chamber. One scientist slowly lowered his data tablet. Another replayed the footage twice without speaking. Finally, Dr. Lasara looked toward Koresh. He never attempted to overpower it. Koresh gave the smallest nod. "No." He understood something we overlooked. "What?" she asked. Koresh kept watching the human quietly repairing the disturbed stones outside his shelter. "The strongest creature on this planet is not the one that survives every encounter. It is the one that knows which encounters should never happen in the first place." 7 days had passed since Nathan first stepped onto Chronos 5, although the number only mattered because he scratched a new mark into the cave wall each morning. The days themselves had started blending together. Wake before sunrise. Check the water vines. Repair whatever the planet had damaged overnight. Study the land before moving through it. It was no longer about surviving until tomorrow. It was about learning something today that tomorrow might demand. As he climbed a familiar ridge that afternoon, something caught his attention halfway up the slope. A narrow strip of polished metal reflected the pale sunlight from beneath a layer of dark stone. Nathan froze. "That does not belong here," he whispered. He carefully cleared away loose gravel with his hands until the corner of an old emergency beacon appeared beneath the dust. The casing was badly weathered, but the unmistakable symbol of the Galactic Research Assembly was still visible beneath years of erosion. "You have got to be kidding me," Nathan breathed. "Somebody was here before me." Above the planet, a warning notification flashed across the observation chamber. Dr. Lasara looked up from her console. "He has reached Sector 9. One of the researchers immediately looked toward Koresh. "That area was sealed decades ago." Koresh slowly nodded. "The original survey expedition disappeared there." Another scientist frowned. "Officially, no recoverable equipment remained." Lasara zoomed in on the live feed and quietly said, "Apparently, that report was wrong." Nathan brushed away more dirt until the beacon finally came free. Its power cell had long since failed, but the housing remained intact. He turned it over and noticed deep scratches carved into the metal by hand. They were not random marks. Someone had etched directional arrows across the casing. Beside them was a single translated warning left by one of the earlier explorers. "Higher ground. Always." Nathan stared at the message for several seconds before quietly nodding. "Thank you," he said to a stranger who had likely never imagined anyone would read those words. Following the arrows led him farther along the ridge than he had ever traveled before. Nearly 2 hours later, the mountains opened into a hidden plateau sheltered by towering cliffs. At first glance, it looked abandoned, but then Nathan noticed something impossible. Half buried beneath vines and mineral deposits stood the twisted remains of an alien survey shelter. One wall had collapsed years earlier, yet part of the structure still stood. Nathan slowly stepped inside. Dust covered everything. Broken storage containers lined one side of the room. A cracked environmental scanner rested against the far wall beside several ruined data modules. "Looks like you folks left in a hurry," he murmured. Most of the equipment had become useless long ago, but engineers rarely looked at machines the way everyone else did. Nathan began sorting through the debris piece by piece. One battery housing was destroyed. Another still held intact wiring. A damaged communications panel contained several reusable circuit boards. He smiled despite himself. "You are not junk," he said while laying the parts into careful piles. "You are spare parts waiting for another job." Back aboard the assembly station, the room had become unusually tense. Dr. Lasara compared archived expedition records against the live video. That shelter belonged to Expedition 12. They vanished 43 years ago. A younger researcher looked bewildered. No rescue team ever located it. Koresh folded his hands behind his back, never taking his eyes off Nathan. Yet the human found it within a week. Nobody challenged the observation. They simply watched Nathan carefully disconnect usable components from machines that every previous expedition had written off as worthless. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Nathan held up a weathered signal transmitter no larger than his hand. It was damaged, incomplete, and silent. Still, for the first time since arriving on Kronos 5, he was no longer looking at what the planet had taken away from him. He was looking at the possibility of speaking to the stars again. For the next 3 days, Nathan barely left the abandoned survey shelter. The cave had kept him alive, but this forgotten outpost offered something far more valuable. Possibility. Every waking hour was spent surrounded by broken panels, cracked wiring, rusted connectors, and machines that everyone else had already given up on. Nathan rubbed the dust from an old power regulator and smiled. "You are ugly," he said, turning it over in his hands. "But I have fixed uglier." Piece by piece, he dismantled every damaged device he could find. One circuit still carried a tiny charge. Another housing protected an undamaged relay. A fractured antenna still contained enough conductive material to rebuild part of the signal transmitter. Nothing worked by itself, but together they began looking less like junk and more like a puzzle. Hundreds of miles above the planet, the observation chamber had become unusually crowded. Researchers from other departments now stood shoulder to shoulder around the live display. Dr. Lasara enlarged the feed as Nathan carefully soldered 2 mismatched components together using the emergency repair tool from his engineering kit. "He is reconstructing the expedition's emergency beacon," she said quietly. A systems engineer from the assembly frowned. That cannot function. Those components were never designed to operate together. Koresh answered without looking away from the screen. He is not rebuilding the original device. The engineer looked confused. Then what is he building? Koresh watched Nathan pause to sketch another diagram across the back of an empty food wrapper before trying a different wiring pattern. Whatever the available parts allow him to build. Nathan leaned back with a tired sigh as another connection failed. A small spark flickered across the damaged relay before everything went dark again. He closed his eyes for a moment and laughed quietly to himself. "All right," he said. "That one was on me." Instead of getting frustrated, he reached for his notebook of rough sketches and crossed out the failed design. Back home, mistakes usually meant another trip to the supply room. Out here, every mistake became part of the blueprint. Late that afternoon, while searching beneath another collapsed storage cabinet, Nathan uncovered a sealed data recorder no larger than a lunchbox. The casing was scratched, but the memory core remained intact. It powered on for only a few seconds before the failing battery died again. Those few seconds were enough. A faded recording appeared on the tiny display. An exhausted alien explorer looked directly into the camera. "If anyone finds this..." The recording crackled before stabilizing. "Do not waste your strength fighting this world. Learn its rhythm. Every expedition failed because we kept trying to make the planet adapt to us." The image froze forever. Nathan stared at the silent screen for several long moments before gently placing it on the table. "Looks like we figured out the same lesson," he whispered. That evening he connected the final wire inside the rebuilt transmitter. He hesitated before pressing the activation switch. Nothing happened. He smiled anyway. Then he loosened one connector, rotated it 90 degrees, and tightened it again. A faint green light flickered across the battered housing. Once, then twice. Finally, the tiny indicator remained steadily illuminated. Nathan let out a long breath he had not realized he was holding. "Well," he said with a grin spreading across his face. "Hello there." The observation room erupted into stunned silence. Every monitor confirmed the same impossible reading. A signal, weak but unmistakable, had begun transmitting from a station officially declared unrecoverable more than 4 decades earlier. Dr. Lasara slowly lowered her tablet. He repaired technology that our own recovery teams abandoned. Koresh remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the tiny blinking light inside the ruined shelter. For the first time since Nathan's arrival, the veteran scientist was no longer studying how long a human could survive on Class-5. He had begun wondering what humanity might accomplish if someone ever stopped underestimating them. Nathan did not celebrate when the transmitter finally came alive. He simply sat there on the cold stone floor, listening to the faint pulse repeating every few seconds. The signal was weak. It might never reach anyone. It might fade before sunrise. But after everything Class-5 had thrown at him, hope did not need to be loud to be real. He leaned against the wall of the abandoned shelter and looked out across the endless valley that had nearly become his grave. "I guess we both underestimated each other," he said quietly to the planet. Hours later, inside the Galactic Research Assembly, every communications console lit up with the same incoming transmission. It was incomplete, broken by static, and repeated on an endless loop. Identification confirmed. Emergency beacon active. Unknown operator alive. The room fell silent. No one spoke because no one could explain what they were seeing. Expedition 12 had failed. Recovery teams had failed. Every prediction about the human had failed. Dr. Lasara slowly looked toward High Biologist Koresh. "The signal is authentic." Koresh nodded once. "I know. Should we dispatch a rescue vessel?" Another official asked. For the first time since Nathan arrived on Class-5, the question required no debate. Koresh answered immediately. "Launch it now." 2 days later, a rescue shuttle descended through the gray clouds that had once carried Nathan to what everyone believed would be his final destination. The crew stepped onto the surface expecting to search for remains or perhaps recover another abandoned beacon. Instead, they found a man walking toward them at a steady pace with a weathered backpack over one shoulder and a repaired transmitter tucked beneath his arm. His beard was longer. His clothes were faded. His hands carried fresh scars from weeks of rebuilding, climbing, and surviving. But his eyes were calm. One rescue officer removed his helmet and stared in disbelief. "Mr. Brooks," he said softly, "how are you still standing?" Nathan looked around at the familiar cliffs before smiling the same tired smile he had worn since the day he arrived. Honestly, he said, one problem at a time. The flight back to the assembly station was unusually quiet. Doctors performed scans that made little sense to them. Nathan's muscles had strengthened. His lungs had adapted to the crushing atmosphere. Even his balance had changed after weeks under relentless gravity. Yet the greatest change could not be measured by any medical instrument. He no longer looked at impossible situations the same way. At the formal review hearing, the entire chamber waited for Koresh to explain the results of the experiment. The veteran scientist stood before representatives from dozens of worlds, then looked directly at Nathan before speaking. For centuries we believed survival belonged to the strongest species, he said. Our research was flawed. He paused long enough for every delegate to meet his eyes. Strength is valuable. Intelligence is valuable. Technology is valuable. But none of those qualities matter if a civilization refuses to learn. This human did not conquer Class-5. He respected it. He observed it. He adapted to it. While we kept measuring the limits of his body, we completely overlooked the flexibility of his mind. No one applauded. The silence carried far more weight than applause ever could. Nathan finally received the document he had asked about before the shuttle door first opened. His appeal had been approved. The conviction was erased. As he signed the final page, Koresh quietly approached him. There is something I still do not understand, the scientist admitted. Nathan capped the pen and smiled. What is that? Koresh glanced toward the stars beyond the chamber window. After everything you endured, why are you not angry? Nathan slipped the old family photograph back into his pocket before answering. Because anger would have kept me alive for a day, he said. Learning kept me alive long enough to come home. Years later, students across the galaxy no longer studied Class-5 as the world that no intelligent life could survive. They studied it as the place where an ordinary engineer quietly reminded an entire civilization that the most dangerous thing to underestimate is not strength, talent, or technology. It is a person who refuses to stop learning, even when the world gives them every reason to give up.